All right, all, welcome back. We'll take a moment for individuals to join. And while we're doing so, I would like to introduce our next guest. She is an architect, Nmadili Okwumabua. She is also a cultural designer, an urbanist, and an educator in African architecture and urban planning. Her passion for design is rooted in a vision where communities in Africa and the diaspora developed with new architectural languages that preserve heritage and are culturally and environmentally sustainable. She has founded a research incubator and and educates individuals about these Sudano-Sahelian architectural forms and incorporates them into her own designs. So with that, I would like to welcome Nmadili.
Okay, hi. Hope everybody can hear me. Hi, Terry. Yes, hi, Terry. Okay, let me share my screen, and then we'll jump right in. One moment. Okay. Slideshow from the beginning. And we'll hide the controls. Okay, so once again, I want to say thank you very much for the introduction and for the welcome. My name is Nmadili Okwumabua. Very hard to say, got a lot of letters in there. Some of them are silent, but it's Nmadili. And I'm really, really excited to be here today to present at the 2024 ASA Teachers Workshop, Islam in Africa. I am Nigerian American from Delta State in Nigeria. So I will be sharing from a very holistic perspective on our lecture today. Let's see. All right, so like Tabby said, I founded an organization called the Community Planning and Design Initiative, and it was created to fill a gap that we found in our typical curriculums in schools, whether it's high school, university. We were not finding a lot of curriculums that were taught from an Afrocentric perspective. So like we've talked about today, many teachers would find it very difficult to teach on Africa. Students would find it difficult to find research to incorporate Afrocentric design philosophies into their projects. And so we created this parallel academic platform as a resource for teachers and students to see how they could learn about Africa and incorporate that in their classrooms and in their projects. CPDIAfrica.org. Okay, so with that, today's presentation is going to be a mixture of architecture and of course, Islamic architecture. We're going to combine the two, African architecture, Islamic architecture, architecture in general. How do we start out? How do we teach on Sudano-Sahelian architecture in Africa, its cultural significance and continued relevance as an environmentally sustainable architectural model? For that, we need to look at the definition of architecture itself. Typically, architecture is defined as the art and science of constructing a building. But when we dig deeper, we understand that architecture is the reflection of a people's culture, their lifestyle, aesthetics, local building materials, the climate, geography, political and economic purchasing power of a people in place. It's all of these intangibles manifested into the built environment to make tangible cultural heritage, right? So that is how we define architecture. So from there, we can begin to look at how these design prototypes will present in different spaces. So if I showed you these images, I think most of us would know immediately this must be Chinese or Japanese or Asian architecture. It's a language that is very expressive visually. When you see it, it's not just science or engineering. There is an art to the architecture, and it identifies people, place, their aesthetics, their culture. If I showed you these images, you would think probably, maybe, if you visited Holland, Dutch architecture, the gingerbread houses, you might be familiar. Or if you saw this prototype, you would begin to think of probably Saudi Arabia, the Middle East, North Africa. There's an aesthetic, there's a materiality to the images that gives context to place, to region. Our mosques, immediately we begin to recognize, again, this is an African architectural language, it's Islamic, we'll talk more about that. But these images, we immediately begin to understand, okay, this must be an African architectural aesthetic. So in 2014, we mark our 10 years this month, CPDI Africa was launched, and it's a culture-inspired, research-based design-build initiative created to inspire the development of African-centered design languages for Africa and the diaspora that are culturally and environmentally sustainable. We wanted to have architects join us to fast-track an evolution of contemporary design languages that preserved this heritage and identity. We didn't want it to just stay in the past. Some people see it as relics or something you see for museum architecture only, but how can we continue to preserve these cultures and faiths in our built environment today? We found out that, of course, we had to do a lot of teaching because most designers were not familiar with African architectural languages. Of course, it's very hard for them to find instructors that could teach. So we had to do a lot of teaching in the beginning. And of course, the first thing you want to do is show location, right? So where is Africa? What is that map? What might the continent have looked like before we started defining it in sub-Saharan Africa or the Sahara Desert or Black Africa or Northern Africa, right? Lands of the Sahel and the Savannah. How did Africans themselves, thousands of years ago, allocate themselves on the continent, and how did they emerge? So we had to do a lot of teaching. Also, we had to explain that, like our Prof. Usman said earlier, we've got to get out of the habit of calling African people tribes and all of those now derogatory terms. When you think about the population of France, 40 million, the population of the Yorubas, 40 million, why is one called a nation and one called a tribe? So we do want to get some of those words out of our dictionary. But these two maps, the one on the left shows Africa today, the 54 national identities, post-colonial times. But the map on the right is my favorite because it shows the true Africa. Africa, in fact, those thousands of black lines denote the true ethnicities, the nations within nations in Africa and how they define themselves. So for example, in Nigeria, which is where I'm actually speaking from, and hopefully the internet will stay steady. In Nigeria, we have over 250 ethnic groups. So that will be 250 distinct architectural languages. And like Professor Usman also showed in his map, almost 50% of the continent, there's that line down the middle where the north is Islamic, the south is Christian. And then you have these spiritual identities, and then you have the ethnic identities. Are you Shakiri? Are you Zulu? Are you Luo? Are you, from Senegal? What ethnicity are you? And so all of these factors will dictate on your architectural language. Okay, so we're going somewhere, y'all stay with me. This next map, I talk about the fact that, yes, Africans were taken out of the continent, whether they were Christians, they were Muslims, or they were traditionalists, they were taken out to the Americas, out east, up into Europe, and they carried a lot of these sensibilities with them. So when we're talking about preservation of identity and culture and architecture, what was taken on those boats? We know that Islam came into Africa 1,000 years ago, and then Christianity came in 500 years ago. So the impact of these outside cultures blended at different rates But all of these make up the African identity, and they moved out into these distant spaces. What architectural practices would they have taken with them? Okay, so African architecture, developing a lens in which to understand and preserve cultural and sustainable practices in African design languages, which is what we're talking about today in this lecture. We came up with 5 lenses in which to view identity and preservation: culture, aesthetics, spirituality, local materials, and community engagement. We'll take these one at a time so you begin to see some examples. So for example, culture is an intangible, but you could say as defined by how your family, let's say if we use family as that intangible in culture, how does architecture represent, how is culture represented architecturally? So for example, on the left, we see that traditional floor plan. We have very large families in Africa. Polygamy was often the order of the day, then really still is. So you would have these very large compounds, many rooms surrounding courtyards. Based on faith, religion. In Islam, women are very protected. They have private spaces in the rear areas of the floor plans. So you would look at culture represented in architecture that way. On the right, we have some contemporary ideas that came out of our architecture competitions at CPDI to show how we could modernize these architectural languages, but still keep the culture and the identity. Aesthetics is the first thing you see when you see something, right? This is Hausa architecture in northern Nigeria. As we know, most of northern Nigeria is Muslim, and luckily for the North, Islam was very accommodating. Like Professor said earlier, if your practices were not in direct opposition to the faith, you were allowed to keep them. And so we would see that in Nigeria, for example, Northern architecture still holds a lot of its aesthetic identity and cultural identity. In the South, not so much so. Christianity kind of deleted a lot of traditional practices when it came to the built environment. Another example of aesthetics, when we're talking about preserving culture and identity, architects today who practice Afrocentric architecture would derive inspiration from artifacts, patterns, motifs. In this case, architect Pierre Goudiabe draws inspiration from these Ghanaian stools and Egyptian headrests for his ECOWAS building in Lomé, Togo. So we're going through these 5 elements, and we've done culture, we've talked about aesthetics. How about spirituality? Here is the mosque in Djenné, the Djenné Mosque in Mali. You can see that this is an African architectural language. African people had practices, faiths of their own. For those on the continent who have practiced Islam for the past 1,000 years, often when I would speak to architects and ask, what are your specific architectural practices? A lot of times they would not be able to say, because it's been so long that they have been practicing Islam. But when you look clearly, it is obvious that architecturally, that identity still remains. We have an idea what mosques look like from the Middle East, Saudi Arabia. We'll look at one image in the presentation, but this obviously speaks a different language. It's spirituality being practiced in an African architectural language. I throw this in here just to give you another example of those who are not practicing Christianity or Islam. For example, the folks in Cameroon who are fiercely proud of their own identity and spirituality. The snake and the spider have a lot of symbolism. And in this museum here, they paid homage to these animals. Materials, very important. You can see on the images on the left, our ancestors on the continent knew, talking about sustainability, the fact that Africa is very hot, the science and technology embedded in African architecture was known to every African. Architecture was part of the culture. Every man, woman, and child knew how to design and build with the materials of their location and using the design philosophies, floor plans, spirituality, all of those things, construction techniques in their architecture. Clay was just perfect for the continent. Why? It keeps the heat out, keeps the rooms nice and cool. This contemporary building on the right was a submission that came in from one of our competitions where a Russian architect pulled inspiration from the materials and the aesthetic, but definitely the materials that we see from the images on the left. Lots of architecture from Islamic areas throughout the continent, whether it's Ghana, whether it's Nigeria, and whether it's Senegal. In his building, he uses rammed earth, which is a contemporary way of achieving the architecture that we see on the left, which is its traditional form. The last of our elements is community engagement. The fact that Africa was not built getting loans, it wasn't a capitalist situation. Most African societies were built by the people. Men, women, and children came together. It was sweat equity. That practice is still done in many rural areas in Africa. And so I'm showing here the fact that people came together and they helped each other to build their communities. This architectural practice is very important. We'll see as we talk about preservation and environmental sustainability. So our focus today, out of the 5 elements, culture, aesthetics, spirituality, local materials, and community engagement, we want to focus on the last 3. Spirituality, materials, and community engagement. How translating these elements continue to have cultural and significant relevance as an environmentally sustainable architectural model. This is a national mosque here in Abuja, the federal capital of Nigeria. As you can see, its language is definitely coming in from outside. It is an imported language. It is a faith that, yes, half of Nigerians practice, and most of the mosques today are designed and built in this model. However, earlier on, when Islam first came into the continent, traditional architecture was allowed to be used to build mosques where people would pray and practice the Islamic faith. This mosque here, we know it's preserved UNESCO. This is in Ghana. Not only is it clay, we see the timber scaffolding, we see the color. Often the materials that were used outside of the clay, even for the finishing, the chalk, or using certain plants that you could boil and paint, using animal bones to paint. So everything was very organic and very sustainable. Again, we can't get away from the fact that earth, readily available, readily affordable, right? No such thing as issues with affordable housing because you're using the earth that comes from your site. This is an amazing masterpiece to me, once again, a mosque in Niger, built with traditional design technique, aesthetics, and materials. Today, looking at some contemporary mosques, I will talk about the work of Adesokunbi, who is a very amazing architect here in Lagos, Nigeria. His Abuja Mosque has been making waves worldwide. He is winning all types of awards for building a very contemporary take on this edifice, on a mosque, right? But he's keeping with the materiality. The inside, I don't have any photographs right now in this presentation on the inside, but the spaces for prayer for men, those for women, the areas for ablution. I really encourage you to look up this mosque. This is such a contemporary take, and it is so well loved here in Nigeria. Another example of contemporary translation of this form is at the Hikma complex in Niger by architect Mariam Kamara. who does an amazing job of bringing in the community to work with her when she's creating her forms. This was a former mosque that was turned into a library and a cultural center, again, keeping that language preserved in the community. We can never get away from talking about Islam and architecture and Afrocentricity in the built environment with the mosque at Djenné in Mali, often said the largest man-made earth structure still in existence. It was originally built in the 13th century, I believe, but was rebuilt in 1906. And what I love about this example is the fact that community engagement is practiced here at its best. We've seen these images before, hopefully annually when this mosque needs to be maintained. It is a major celebration in the community. Men, women, children all come out to participate in renovating and maintaining this mosque. It's not an issue of child labor laws or there's no role for women. Everyone participates. You're carrying water, you're mixing the clay, you're plastering. There's a very big celebration afterward. That was typical to architectural practices in Africa. And the idea, once again, that people can be self-sufficient and not needing to have to always go out asking and soliciting for funds, taking loans that you cannot pay back when you have community members that are ready and are able and are skilled. Bringing this type of practice back into our everyday would be so important for so many reasons in terms of affordability and sustainability. More images of Djenné being maintained. Very beautiful architecture. And once again, you can never underestimate the impact of the community. Francis Carey, Pritzker Prize winner from Burkina Faso, does it like no one else. Educated in Germany, he comes back to Africa and he gets men, women, and children to help him build schools and so many other buildings. Burkina Faso is considered as one of the poorest nations in the world, but it's not poor if they can do this, right? And whose definition of poverty are we speaking? And I think that was what I got from Prof. Ngom when he said literacy. If you're not speaking in English or reading in a European language and you're illiterate, meanwhile, you have your language and you're quite literate. This is a definition of architecture that is no longer practiced wholeheartedly because it's so community-based and it's not about capitalism, right? But a very, very important trait for architecture. Miriam Kamari, we also already talked about, trained in the US, gets back to her home country and realizes the architecture she's building is so hard to understand. People are not able to afford. And she gets people, her community members, to come in and help. And of course, another award-winning architect. The last one I'll talk about is Robert Taylor's beautiful school at Tuskegee. After emancipation, African Americans not having earned any money for hundreds of years during slavery, were now free and had to bring themselves up by their bootstraps, as we say. So they had to practice that community engagement. They built their own schools, sweat equity, and that was your tuition, right? So these practices are still being done around the world, even in the diaspora, like I talked about, right? Africans carried their practices wherever they were taken to, whether it was Americas, Europe, and so on. But the most important person who has practiced this or incorporated this technique of community engagement into his work was Millard Fuller with Habitat for Humanity. Back in the 40s, he's in the Congo doing on a missionary trip, and he sees a family and their friends building a home. For themselves, it's free, it's sweat equity. He brings that concept back to America and launches Habitat for Humanity. And what is that? That's community engagement. People in the church, it could be any faith, it could be in the mosque, right? And they're helping each other to build. So in conclusion, The preservation of identity, spirituality, and culture through architecture has value to future generations in so many ways. Affordability is the biggest one for me. The issues of homelessness, that was unheard of in Africa before. Today, people do all types of things just to have monies to pay rent or to build homes. There are no mortgages, right? Number two, the understanding of sustainable materials will aid in solving global warming and climate change calamities caused by the built environment profession, right? 40% of global warming is actually caused by the materials that we use today, cement and tar, right? Africans were the original green architects. So bringing these materials back into practices today will begin to solve a lot of our challenges worldwide, not just only in Africa. And then working together in community, contributing sweat equity will ease affordable housing problems. That one I've already mentioned. I think that one is priceless for me. Sustainability and affordability, to me, go hand in hand. People should be able to take care of themselves. Like I said, architecture was actually part of the culture in most African communities, and we need to bring that back. I will close on that. I will say thank you, and then I'll wait to hear a few questions from you all.
Yes, thank you, Nmadili. This is just a wonderful presentation. It's so rich and so informative. And architecture is a very important part of the Gold Road. Next slide. So what is the Gold Road? Well, just very briefly, the Gold Road is a online website that's freely available, and it was inspired by the Silk Road. The latter, as you know, is a popular instructional approach that teaches about the ancient trade route that connected the Western world with the Middle East and Asia. So what we hope was that the Gold Road concept would bring a similar type of instructional attention to West African trade routes, which was very much an understudied part of the medieval world. There has been deep scholarly attention on medieval West Africa, the trade routes and the empires that have been available for decades, but this information is rarely integrated into K through 12 materials. The award-winning secondary school textbook, which is Empires of Medieval West Africa, which won a CABA award back in 2005, is written by David Conrad. And it seemed to me a way to make this happen. So we invited Dr. Conrad to use the text and his deep knowledge of the Western Sudan to create dramatic voices from historical people from medieval West Africa. And in 2017, myself and Vanessa Oyugi piloted Conrad's voices in professional workshops in the Washington, D.C. area, and we also presented at the Middle States Conference in Maryland. And later, with the help of Anya Ueno, who's at Howard University, and Elsa Ville, who you've met already from Boston University, we expanded beyond the people concept to add other topics of study, including landscapes, places, trade, artifacts, and architecture. Balance Studio, a digital media company, helped us put this information into an interactive website. And in late 2020, thanks to the pandemic, when we were trapped and had to do a lot, and that was what we were doing a lot with our time, we formally launched the Gold Road Interactive website. It is a work in progress, and we certainly do welcome your suggestions. And I think now I'm going to turn it over to, is it Vanessa? Are you're next to share the active Gold Road site?
Yes, Martha, I'm about to start sharing. All right, so I'm unmuted? Can everyone hear me?
You're good, Vanessa. I can hear you. You're good.
Great. All right, so I will actually just take a few moments because we are pressed for time a little bit to show you the actual live site, the Gold Road. Let me make this a little smaller. Just to give you a brief overview and to also show you how you can access the information on architecture in medieval Africa. But I want to show you the ways that you can get there is this URL, thegoldroad.org. And really quickly, there's another way to get there. This is our home page from the Howard University Center for African Studies, and here's the outreach page, and you can get some of our resources here as well. But for now, let's just begin this experience. And what you see here when you access the site is the welcome message, which you can both read and you can also listen to. But let's close this up, and then you see the Google map. It starts off with a Google map of Africa and a little bit beyond Africa. And so you can see the topography, the present day countries and capital cities, the desert, the Sahel, the ocean and the seas and the lakes. But hidden is a scaffolded content that is hidden in these categories that you see on the top bar and this information bar. And so we can get started and click on the first one. And these has to be toggled on to get to the content. So we click on Ghana Empire, and what you see there is an outline right here in yellow of where the empire would have been. And we can continue just adding this. And you can see then the Mali Empire and the outlines of that, and add the Songhai Empire. And so this is already in itself, just this page right here with this toggling is a great way to just ask, what current day countries would have been subsumed under, each empire. So that's already just a great entry point. And then let's move on to add the landscapes. And so here you see these markers that populate on the left, and you can take a look, and they jump every time you hover over them. And so we've been working back and forth with Balance Studio to create this. And so please, feedback is always welcome. But as you can see, then the rivers, the oases, and then the Sahara, the Sahel, and the Savannah. And just simply even toggling just these 5 buttons, like the time periods and the landscapes, can also be a great entry point in just simply setting a geographical context to understanding the environment that facilitated the growth of the Gold Road trade, as a lot of the presenters have talked about, and also, of course, the spread of Islam by facilitating trade routes and creating these centers of commerce like Timbuktu, which attracted Muslim traders and so on. So actually, let us go to places now, like places like Timbuktu. And I'm toggling off landscapes just because it's kind of busy and I want it to be a little less busy for purposes of the demonstration. But let's go to Timbuktu right here. And you can see we have all these different cities that you can click on. It's a lot of content. But did I just pass it? Where is Timbuktu? There we go. So let's just click on Timbuktu to see what a marker of ours looks like. So here we have a pronunciation. I'm not sure if you're able to hear
Timbuktu.
this. So most of them, we're still working on this, have a pronunciation guide. And then we have a text, a narrative, and we draw from secondary sources that are important, a lot of them from David Conrad, as Brenda mentioned, and also secondary sources. Also primary sources when we have them. And we always have an image gallery, or when we are able to have an image gallery. These were pictures that David Conrad gave us, and which we can all use, and you can use in your classroom as well. How can I go back? There we go. So you can take a look at all these pictures and use those as helpful prompts for activities or for projects for students. And moving on, I'm going to just jump here to trade and artifacts. And the one that I'll show you here briefly is this beautiful, beautiful pendant, this gold pendant right here, which was found in a burial ground in the 1940s. And what's interesting, it was found buried with a young man who was about 20 years of age and clearly of high status. And the radiocarbon dating suggests that it was a date around 1300, which makes the young man possibly one of the ruling elite subject to Mansa Musa. So again, this just shows the heavy circulation of gold in this time and the connections that can be made about trade. Let's just move to people, and to stick with the topic of architecture, let me find a person here, Al-Sahili, who is an Andalusian poet and architect that met Mansa Musa on his Hajj in Mecca, and returned with Mansa Musa to build and to design many different buildings, one of them being the great Jingareber Mosque. And let me jump to that right here. And when we click on this last category, we can actually go here. Here we have a list of different architecture, but we can click on the Jinga River Mosque. And again, we have some pieces of information. And again, we have images that you can use from donated again by Dr. David Conrad. And I think some of them are also by Elsa V. Hay, who got these from her many travels to the area. So this scaffolded content here with all these different time periods and the categories, we think allows for different entry points for students, for student inquiry, for student research. Students can either deep dive into one particular aspect or make connections between the two. And so we welcome, your feedback on this. Lastly, because we don't have time, I do want to show you that there's a teacher's corner. And we are consistently adding to this as we continue to work on this. And here we have different lessons that you can access. I'm not going to click on them, but please, in your time, make sure that you do. We just added these Making Freedom lessons that maybe Elsa can mention towards the end, and different maps so we can engage the trade routes and discuss trade routes, and some highlighted resources. And here, this one is actually very useful for architecture because it has the 3D images of, I think, about 2 mosques in Mali that you can also take a look at. So as I just said before, this is a work in progress. We do welcome your feedback in terms of how the information is organized, what could be useful. But this is the end of my brief overview of the Gold Road website, and I turn it now to Elsa Vie to show you some of these activities and bring this content alive.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Vanessa. Can everybody see my screen? Thank you, Shane, also for the note that we are running a little bit late, so I will try to keep my sharing of the resources under 2 minutes. So, of course, we included architecture, buildings, because they are important primary sources. They are evidence of cultural practices and dynamic societies from across time. And I loved your language, Nmadili, around the design language, architecture language, what kind of language it is. So as you click on architecture here, if you click on the Ghana Empire, you can see and you then click on the Mali Empire, you see how the buildings get built over time. So let's just do this and you see the list grow. So that is one important aspect. One amazing building that Nmadili mentioned is the Larabanga Mosque. So you can find that here. And one of the amazing ways you can engage this content is by personifying this architecture. So I'm going to scroll down to this slide right here, and looking at a marker, and we're going to look straight at the University of Al-Qarawiyyin. And here we can learn that the university, which is located currently in Morocco, in Fez, Morocco, it was said to be the oldest university in the world, founded by 2 women, Fatima Al-Fahiri and her sister Mariam. Al-Qarawiyyin is named after Kairouan, so that's an amazing way that students can learn from this and use the markers to do research. And one way that they have to render this research is by looking at and researching the different markers to create a pop-up. So this is a pop-up that I worked on with 2 friends, ages 8 and 10-year-old, on the great Al-Qarawiyyin Mosque. It was a wonderful engagement. I worked with them looking at the marker right here of the Al-Qarawiyyin. We watched the video together and learned about the amazing manuscripts that are held in Al-Qarawiyyin Mosque, and then chose pictures together. And with younger learners, you can ask them, and even older learners, you can ask them to personify and connect to the building as a primary source through asking, if this building would speak, what would it say? So this is one of the resources that we encourage everybody to use when you're talking about buildings, because it allows for student connection and feeling. So you ask, using this organizer, you can ask students to describe the building in its context, to look at the materials that were used in building it, the function, the social function. How did people engage and use this building? What meaning did it have? What meaning does it have? Because many of the buildings on the Gold Road right here, if I close this marker and go here, all of them from the Nmadili and Songhai Empire are still existing today and are still in use and are still vibrant spaces of culture. And so one way to do this is then to push their imagination of what it's like to be in this building, to feel the atmosphere of a building, and you can use adjectives to support them. And that is what I did when we worked on this I Am poem. This is how my 8 and 10-year-old friends were able to write this. I am the great Al-Qarawiyyin Mosque. I live in the middle of the old city of Fez in Morocco. I am the oldest university in the world. I was built in the year 859. And then we did the math, 1165 years ago. I am proud to have been created by 2 women, and so on and so forth. So I will not read the whole poem, but that is one way to engage the architecture of the Gold Road, the buildings of the Gold Road, and to invite students to connect to it and analyze them and render their research projects through a pop-up. I think we are right on time for the next presentation. So thank you so much.